Hello, it's Lord Slar here, bringing you a rant. It's been a long time since I've properly done one of these, and this time it's without somebody else, as I want to do this one on my own as an episode which I personally seem to have more hatred for than most. Often on this channel I give New Who a good lashing and spare the rod for Classic Who. This isn't because I'm being unfair on New Who, but it's just rather that New Who stories are bad in a much more interesting way than most Classic Who stories, hence there's a lot more to talk about. However, for the sake of fairness, today I'm going to tear apart what I consider to be one of the worst Classic Who stories, The King's Demons. The King's Demons is a two-part pseudo-historical episode of Doctor Who that takes place during the reign of King John before the signing of Magna Carta, which for those of you who don't know was the first move in Britain towards parliamentary democracy, which ended up having a large impact on the world. However, in this story there is something wrong with King John. Yeah, that's it, and it doesn't sound that exciting, does it? And believe me, the reveal of what's really going on is not only disappointing, but also makes no sense. Before I dive into the main issues I have with this story, let's discuss some of the lesser problems, just to build up. First of all, the direction is piss poor. Despite how grey and ugly some of the location look works, there is actually some pretty good camera shots. However, the location work is only in the first 10 minutes of the story, and the rest is studio bound. And let me tell you, it's some of the flattest, point-and-shoot direction you've ever seen. There is no effort to make anything look exciting or dynamic. The camera just points at the scene in a very standard angle, which leads to the episode being quite hard on the eyes. It struggles to retain your attention. The sword fight in the episode has to be one of the worst sword fights we've ever seen in Doctor Who. I mean, they managed to make a Doctor-Master sword fight boring. It just makes me wish I was watching the Sea Devils, and I'm not even a massive fan of that story. The main cast are also poorly utilised. The Doctor gets about one funny line in the entire thing, and the rest of it is played so straight-faced you want to go to sleep. And it's not like this episode has any tension or quality of writing to pull off a straight-faced episode. The stakes aren't even that high. But we'll get to that in a moment. Tegan isn't badly used, I suppose. She's one of the few passable things in the story. As for Turlough, what an utter waste. In his first three stories, well, at least Mordred, Undead and Enlightenment, he was extremely well utilised, and he was a companion whose intentions and morals you could never quite be sure of, and he was very interesting to watch and well developed over the Black Guardian trilogy. Here, though, he's barely used. He spends almost the entire story locked up and gets almost no lines. His character doesn't even seem distinct like it did in the previous two episodes. You'd think with such an interesting character you'd do lots with him in his first Master story, but apparently not, and it's frustrating as Turlough remains like this for the rest of his tenure, as if the writers are looking to this episode for his character rather than the ones before it, which were much better. On a more nitpicky note, the music scored for this story is not only quite bland, but completely unfitting. It sounds more like the soundtrack for a Commodore 64 game, not a bloody period drama episode of Doctor Who. So with all that, I think we can conclude the production of this episode is pretty poor, despite the decent costumes, although the set design is quite bland for a BBC historical, and the main cast aren't very well used either. Sure, they're a supporting cast, but since we only have 2 episodes to develop them, they come off as generic and uninteresting. Not to mention the episode has filler scenes in it. It's only 2 parts, yet it has filler. Like, there's a minute of King John just singing a song, for instance. The episode is so lacking in substance, the writer can't even manage 2 episodes without resorting to filler material. To compound this, the plot goes absolutely nowhere for a whole 20 minutes. Halfway into the first episode, the mystery of what's happened to King John is brought up, and it isn't revealed until halfway through episode 2, and almost nothing happens in that whole time. This is a filler story with its own filler. Surely they could have thought of something more interesting to do. The story reeks of a lack of ideas. Now we're moving into why I really dislike the story. All the things I mentioned so far add up to a bad story, but how little sense it makes in terms of the motivations of the Master and his intended outcome is what really makes this piss poor. So the Master's plan in the story is to use a shape-shifting robot called Chameleon to disguise itself as King John and sully his reputation, which somehow stops the Magna Carta being signed, even though the Magna Carta was signed after a rebellion against him. The episode addresses this by saying that this would cause the rebellion to happen sooner and he might be killed in the battle, but surely at that point wouldn't the Master have a much easier time by just killing King John? The plan is convoluted and pointless. Clearly the episode was made where they wanted to put a Master in a story with the Magna Carta without actually coming up with an interesting idea that'd justify commissioning an episode about it. Again, this shows very poor production. A further question in this area is why the Master would even want to do this in the first place. I know Magna Carta was very important in the founding of parliamentary democracy, but making it not be signed would either make something else similar be signed, perhaps just a bit later, as the socio-political factors that led to its signing in the first place would still be present. Even if this meant that parliamentary democracy didn't come about, then surely it would just mean that Earth would have more dictatorial governments in the future, and how does that help the Master? He says that as a result of the chaos that will reign on Earth due to the Magna Carta not being signed, he can become Emperor. Except that just doesn't make sense, as stopping the Magna Carta merely means a different type of government for countries like Britain. This plan would not benefit the Master in any way. The Doctor even comments on this by saying that by the Master's standards this is small-time villainy. And he's right, it doesn't lead to him ruling the universe or anything, he gets no benefit whatsoever. I can imagine the meddling monk doing something like this for sure, but for the Master this plan makes absolutely no sense and is out of character. This episode is just drivel. Another large problem I have is Chameleon. Part of the intention of the story was to introduce Chameleon as a new K9 for the Fifth Doctor. However, considering his next appearance will also be his last, clearly it didn't work. Let's deconstruct why Chameleon is a poor addition to the TARDIS crew. Part of the reason why K9 was so great in the Fourth Doctor era is that his deadpan logic worked well when being bounced off Tom Baker's whimsical Doctor, as well as his companions. Davison is playing a different type of Doctor. He's played very straight-faced, and such a personality doesn't really spark much chemistry with a robot. It just doesn't work well with the tone of the Davison era, and it's pretty clear why they sidelined him until his exit in Planet of Fire, where he's not improved one jot. The design of Chameleon is also way too ambitious. K9 worked because the boxy design made it possible for a very convincing prop to be made. However, Chameleon is a humanoid and is a prop rather than a costume, and as a result, he just looks way too stiff and awkward to be taken seriously, and I imagine it was a lot harder to integrate him with the actors than K9 was. Of course, they could have had Chameleon almost always in disguise as somebody else, for example getting a different actor to play him each episode, which would have actually been really interesting, but of course they didn't do that, and as a result Chameleon was just a really poorly thought out idea, and even the little potential he had was squandered. People often question why I hate this story so much, and I hope that more of you can now see why I consider it so bad. I respect they were trying to experiment a little bit with Chameleon, but you could tell on paper this wasn't going to work. The Master is extremely poorly used, and it feels like somebody else should have or was originally intended to be in his place, but they shoved him in anyway, and the main cast are misused entirely. It's hard to imagine how anybody thought this was a worthy season finale to the 20th season of Doctor Who, on its 20th anniversary no less. It's a train wreck of massive proportions. Almost everything is at least lackluster, and the story is very poorly thought out in almost every degree. It really is one of the worst Doctor Who episodes ever. Well, what do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Tell me down in the comments. If anybody actually really likes this episode, I'd really like to hear a defense of it, as I'd find that quite interesting. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you back next time.